What would you do if your father had spent 40 years building a fortune, and on the day his will was read, your two elder sisters walked away with the house, the land, the accounts, the silver, and the good name, while you were handed nothing but a battered old trunk with a rusted lock, and told to be grateful for the courtesy? What would you do if the trunk was so plain, so warped by damp and time, that even the auctioneer had waved it aside as not worth a shilling? This is the story of Laura Shaw, 23 years old, walking out of a solicitor's office in Willow Creek, with that trunk roped to a borrowed cart. But what waited under its false bottom would undo every smug word her sisters had spoken. Settle in. Tell us where you're watching from. Stay close. The rain had not stopped since the burial. It came down thin and gray over the cobbles of Willow Creek, blackening the slate roofs, running in ribbons off the gutters of the market square, softening the ruts in the lane that ran up past the churchyard toward the moors. Laura kept her head down as she walked. Her boots were mended at the toe with a strip of oiled leather her father had cut for her the winter before he died. Her cloak was too thin for the weather. Her hands, red and chapped, gripped the handle of the small carpet bag that held everything she still owned that was not roped to the cart behind her. Old Ned Harrow led the pony. He had known her father 30 years and had offered the cart without being asked. He walked in silence, which was the kindest thing anyone had offered her that day. Behind them, on the boards, the trunk shifted and thumped against the sideboards with every rut. She did not look back at the town. She had already seen enough of it. She had seen her sisters, Margaret and Adeline, stand at the graveside in mourning silk that had cost more than her year's keep. She had seen them nod at the vicar and dab dry eyes with folded linen. She had seen Margaret take her arm in the churchyard and whisper, almost tenderly, that father had wanted the house kept whole, and that a girl of Laura's temperament would be happier with something small, something she could carry, something she could carry. Laura had said nothing then. She said nothing now. The rain ran off the brim of her bonnet and dripped onto the back of her wrist. The lane climbed, the hedgerows dripped. Somewhere over the fields a rook called once and fell silent. Her father had died on a Tuesday, in the small back parlor of the house on Miller's Lane, with his account books open on the table and his spectacles folded beside them. He had asked for her by name. She had not reached him in time. That was the ache she carried under the cold. Not the fortune, not the silver, not the deeds, only that. By the time the cart turned off the main road onto the rutted track that led up to the tenant cottage Ned had offered her for the winter, the light was already failing. The cottage was low, stone-walled, with a sagging thatch and one crooked chimney. It had stood empty since the last shepherd left it. Ned had swept it and laid a fire. It was the best he could do, and Laura knew it, and she pressed his sleeve once, in silent thanks, as he lifted the trunk down from the cart. Solid, heavier than it looked. He set it in the middle of the flagged floor. Rain hissed on the thatch. The fire caught, sputtered, and settled into a low orange glow. Ned tipped his cap and left her to it, and the door closed on the sound of the pony's hooves fading down the lane. Laura stood a long time looking at the trunk. It was oak, black with age, banded in iron gone red with rust. The lock was crude, the hinges stiff. Someone had once carved initials into the lid, and then, later, tried to sand them out. A pale ghost of the letters remained. She traced them with a fingertip and did not recognize them. Her father's initials had been J.S. These were not. She had begged, in the solicitor's office that morning, for a moment alone with the will. Mr. Bramble had refused politely. Margaret had laughed. Adeline had said, in a voice loud enough for the clerk to hear, That father must have been softening in the head at the last, to leave a grown girl a piece of rubbish from the box room. The clerk had smiled behind his hand. Laura had felt her face burn and had said nothing. Now, alone, with the fire drying the hem of her skirt and the trunk squatting like a stone before her, she knelt on the flags and put both hands flat on the lid. It smelled of dust and something older, cedar, perhaps, and a trace of pipe smoke that caught at her throat and made her eyes sting. Was it truly worthless? This scarred old box her sisters had thrown at her like a bone to a beggar. Had her father, who had never once been sentimental, meant only insult by it? Or had he meant something no one else in that room had eyes to see? If you have ever been handed the smallest share and told to be grateful, take a moment to tell us in the comments, and if this story finds you, tap the like and follow along. Because what Laura Shaw was about to lift from that trunk would rewrite every word her sisters had spoken over their father's grave. The rain had not stopped by morning. It came down in a steady gray curtain that beaded on the small window and seeped along the sill in a dark line. Laura set the trunk aside, unopened. She had knelt with her hands on the lid until the fire burned low, and something in her had refused to lift it in the hour of her worst grief. A trunk opened in bitterness would only offer bitterness back. She banked the coals, ate a heel of bread from her carpet bag, and slept on the pallet Ned had left her, one hand resting against the iron band of the lid, as if it were a shoulder. By late morning, the flour crock in the corner was empty, and the tea tin held only dust. Laura pulled her cloak tight, tied her bonnet, and walked the 1.5 miles of muddy lane back into Willow Creek to buy what she could afford. The village saw her coming. Word travels faster than a cart in a place like Willow Creek, and by the time Laura reached the market square, every doorway had a face in it. Women who had once curtsied to her father drew back a step as she passed. 2 boys leaning against the wheelwright's shed elbowed one another and laughed openly. A shopkeeper's wife murmured behind her hand to a companion, and the word trunk carried on the wet air like the smell of coal smoke. Laura kept her head down and counted her coppers into Mr. Ainsley's palm at the counter of the small provisions shop. He gave her 1/2 pound of flour, a twist of salt, and a wedge of hard cheese. He did not meet her eye, though he had known her since she was in braids. As she turned to leave, the bell above the door rattled, and Margaret swept in with a maidservant carrying a basket at her heel. Margaret paused just long enough to see her sister, and then spoke past her, to Mrs. Ainsley at the till. "A dozen eggs, the brown ones." Mrs. Ainsley bobbed. Laura made for the door. "Laura," Margaret said, without turning, "you look thin." Laura stopped. "The cottage suits you," Margaret went on, examining her gloves. "Small things, for small lives. Do try not to shame us in town." The maidservant would not raise her eyes. Mrs. Ainsley found a great interest in her ledger. Laura said nothing. She had learned, in her father's long silences, that some cruelties answer themselves. She stepped into the rain. At the corner of the churchyard wall, where the yews leaned over the lane and the water dripped in a slow, patient rhythm from the leaves, an old woman was standing under a black umbrella mended with twine. Laura knew her by sight, Widow Halbrook, who had been housekeeper at the rectory for 40 years and had buried 3 husbands and a son. She was very small and very upright, and her eyes were the color of wet slate. "Girl," the widow said. Laura stopped. "Your father was a careful man." The widow's voice was thin and level, the voice of a woman who had used up her tears long ago. "He did not fold his spectacles for nothing." Laura opened her mouth, but the widow was already moving on, small, quick steps in tight black boots, and the umbrella tilted and swallowed her, and she was gone around the wall before Laura could ask what she meant. The rain fell harder. Laura shifted the parcels beneath her cloak, and the words settled in her chest like a stone dropped in still water. He did not fold his spectacles for nothing. She did not understand. She would not, for a long while yet. She walked back the 1.5 miles to the tenant cottage, with the widow's words keeping time to her step. The lane ran between 2 banks of hawthorn, beaded with wet, and the ruts filled and refilled with brown water as she crossed them. By the time she came in sight of the low stone walls and the crooked chimney, the daylight had gone the color of pewter, and the wind had changed, driving the rain sideways under the sagging thatch. Inside, the fire had died to a red eye in the ash. Laura set the parcels on the plank shelf, hung her cloak on a nail, and knelt to build the flames back. She was cold to the bone. Her fingers moved slowly on the flint. When the fire caught, she sat on her heels and stared at the trunk, squatting in the middle of the flagged floor where Ned had left it, and it stared back at her. She fetched the kettle from the hearthstone and filled it from the rain butt outside the door. She hung it on the crane. She cut a slice of the hard cheese and ate it standing, watching the trunk over the rim of a chipped cup. Then she took down the iron poker from beside the fire and knelt to the lock. The lock was old and stiff and clumsy, and it did not want to yield. She worked at it patiently, the way her father had taught her to work at any stubborn thing. A little pressure, a little weight, a little more pressure. Rust flaked onto the flags. Her wrists ached. The rain drummed. Somewhere out on the hill, a sheep called once and was answered. The hasp gave with a small dry crack. Laura sat back on her heels and looked at the trunk for a long moment without lifting the lid. Then she raised it slowly on its stiff hinges, and the smell of cedar and pipe smoke rose up around her face, and she saw what her sisters had counted for nothing. Cloth, old cloth, a folded gray shawl at the top, moth-eaten at one corner. Beneath it, a pair of worn boys' boots, cracked at the sole. A tin cup dented on one side, a worn flannel shirt, a packet of ordinary letters tied with brown string, the paper foxed, and the ink faded. A wooden pipe with a chipped stem, a tarnished hinge, a ball of twine. Laura's throat closed. She lifted each thing carefully and laid it on the flags beside her. The lid dropped once, and she caught it and held it up. She reached to the bottom of the trunk, and her fingers met more cloth, more paper, more small, dull things a man might have kept out of habit and forgotten to throw away. She sat back. The fire ticked. The rain drummed on the thatch. So this was it then. This was what her father had left her. A box room's worth of cast-offs. A dead man's leftover linen. Her sisters had been right. The clerk had been right. She had walked 2 miles in the rain for a pipe and a shawl. She did not cry. She had used up her crying at the graveside and again in the solicitor's office, when no one was watching, and the well was dry. She only sat, very still, with her hands loose in her lap, and the fire's small warmth against her cheek, and looked at the pitiful heap of things laid out on the flags around her, like the belongings of a stranger. After a long while, she folded the shawl again and placed it back in the trunk. She placed the boots and the shirt and the letters back too, one by one, as carefully as if they were her own. She closed the lid, but did not latch it. She dragged the trunk across the flags to the wall beside her pallet, so that when she lay down, she could reach out and touch it. That night she slept with one hand on the iron band and listened to the rain and to the small settling sounds an old wooden thing makes in a cold room, and to the widow's words turning slowly in her head like a key that had not yet found its lock. She woke before dawn to a cold hearth, and the trunk still there, solid against the wall, as though it had grown into the stone overnight. The rain had thinned to a mist. Laura lay for a long time, with her palm flat on the iron band, watching the pale gray light creep up the flagged floor, and it was only when she sat up to rake the coals that the first small wrongness settled on her. The trunk, emptied, ought to feel light. She had lifted flour sacks heavier than the whole of last night's pitiful heap, yet when Ned had set it down 2 days before, he had grunted with the weight of it and shifted his grip twice before it steadied on the flags. She had thought little of it then. A man of his years, a heavy old oak lid, iron banding. But now, kneeling beside it in the mist-gray morning, she pressed both hands to its side and rocked it a 1/4 inch off the stone. It resisted her. It sat like a thing filled. She opened the lid slowly. The shawl, the boots, the shirt, the letters. She lifted each out again and set them in a neat row along the plank shelf, and when the trunk was bare, she reached in and pressed her palm against the wooden bottom. It felt like wood. It sounded like wood when she rapped it with a knuckle. Only, the outside of the trunk stood almost to her waist, and the inside came no higher than her forearm. She measured with her fingers, 2 spans and a thumb from lip to floor within. She measured the outside, 3 spans and more. She sat back on her heels. She looked at the boots on the shelf. Small, cracked at the sole, made for a boy of perhaps 9 or 10. She had had no brother. Her father had had no brother. She turned the boots in her hand and set them down again. Then she reached for the packet of letters. She untied the brown string, and the ink was faded, but the top letter's direction was still legible in a hand she did not know. It was not addressed to her father. It was addressed to a Mr. J. Sheridan, at a village whose name she had never heard, on a date 3 years before she was born. She retied the string exactly as she had found it. She placed the letters back in the trunk, and the boots, and the shirt, and the shawl, in the same order. She closed the lid. She did not force the hasp. She only lowered it, until the iron met iron with a small dry chime. Something had been wrong from the beginning. She had simply been too tired to see it. She did not act. She banked the fire, drew water, and set the kettle on the crane. Widow Halbrook's words moved through her again, slow and even, like a hand testing a door in the dark. Your father was a careful man. He did not fold his spectacles for nothing. Later, when she opened the cottage door to shake the rain from her cloak, an old gray cat sat on the flat stone of the threshold. Its ears were notched. One eye was half closed against the wind, and its ribs showed under wet fur. It looked at her, without moving. She stepped aside, and the cat walked in as though it had lived there 10 years, went straight to the hearth, and lay down at the corner of the flags where the warmth pooled. She named it nothing. She only cut a sliver of the hard cheese and set it on a chipped saucer beside the cat, and after a long while, the cat ate. That day and the days that followed, Laura began to work. There was no plan in it at first, only the need to fill her hands so her mind might quiet. She swept the flagged floor with a bundle of twigs she cut from the hedge. She scrubbed the plank shelf with rainwater and a rag torn from the hem of a garment she would not wear again. She wiped the soot from the small window until the light came in clean. She mended the sagging place in the thatch as well as she could reach with a borrowed ladder, standing in her mended boots, with her hair blown into her eyes, and the cat, watching from the doorstep, with its tail curled around its feet. Every morning she went to the trunk before she lit the fire. She did not open it. She only laid her hand on the iron band, as one might lay a hand on the flank of a horse, to know how it had slept. On the 3rd day she cleaned the trunk itself. She lifted each item out, dusted it, laid it in the sun on the stone step. She wiped the inside with an oiled rag, Her fingers learned the grain of the wood the way they had once, as a child, learned the grain of her father's writing desk, running along it while he worked. And her fingers found what her eyes had missed. Along the inner corner, low down, the wood was joined not as a floor is joined, but as a lid is joined, with a hairline seam so fine it might have been a scratch. She pressed it. It did not give. She said nothing aloud. The cat blinked from the step. She kept working. She scoured the tin cup and set it beside the chipped one on the shelf. She oiled the tarnished hinge with a smear of tallow from the stub of her candle. She unwound the ball of twine and rewound it neatly. She took up the flannel shirt and shook it out, and something small and hard slid from a folded cuff into her palm. A brass button stamped with a mark she did not recognize, a wheel within a wheel. She set it on the shelf beside the other things. Her hands were red and cracked at the knuckle now, and she barely noticed. By the end of the first week, she had read the letters. They were plain enough on their surface. A man writing to Mr. J. Sheridan about a piece of land, about drainage, about a boundary stone that had been moved. But 3 of the letters ended with the same phrase, in the same hand, kept safe, as agreed. And the last of them, the shortest, said only, "The papers are where you left them, and the boy's things atop." Laura folded that letter smaller than the others and put it in the pocket of her dress. The cat had taken to sleeping on the closed lid of the trunk at night. In the mornings, when Laura rose, the cat would rise too, stretch, drop soundlessly to the flags, and go to the door to be let out. Then Laura would sit a moment on the warm place the animal had left and lay her hand again on the iron band and feel, beneath the wood and the age and the rust, the small steady weight of a thing not yet named. On the 9th morning, Laura went to the trunk with the iron poker in her hand and a thin blade Ned had left with the pallet, and she did not wait for the fire to be lit. The cat rose from the lid, stretched, and dropped to the flags. Laura knelt. She lifted out the shawl, the boots, the shirt, the letters, the pipe, the hinge, the twine, the tin cup, and laid them along the plank shelf in the order she had learned them. Then she set the empty trunk on its side by the window, so the pale gray light of morning fell straight into it. The seam was where her fingers remembered it, low in the inner corner, a hairline no wider than a hair. She traced it with the blade until she found the small notch where the wood had been fitted, like a lid rather than a floor. She worked slowly. She did not pry. She eased the blade in the length of a thumb, then 2. Then she felt the wood lift against her hand, as a hair lifts under a palm, alive and reluctant. She set the blade down and used her fingers. The false floor came up in a single piece, a board thinner than she had expected, cut clean, and fitted so close that the dust of years had sealed it. Beneath it lay a bed of oiled linen, folded double. Laura lifted the linen away. There were papers. There was a leather wallet, plump with folded documents, tied twice around with black tape. There was a small tin box the size of a prayer book, its lid soldered along one edge. There was a bundle of 3 keys on a ring. There was a slim ledger, bound in green cloth, the corners bumped, and there was a single sealed envelope, thick paper, her father's hand across the face of it, and on it only her name, Laura, nothing else. She sat back on her heels. The cat had returned from the door and was pressing against her knee. Laura's hand shook when she reached for the envelope, and she set it aside without opening it, because she was afraid to open it first and find something small, and afraid to open it last and find it had waited too long. She untied the leather wallet. The first paper inside was a deed, drawn in the copperplate of a country solicitor, for a field of 11 acres at Hollow Marsh, drained and improved, boundary marked by an oak and a stone. The name on the deed was her father's. Beneath that lay another deed, older, for a cottage and yard on the Willow Creek Road, with a strip of woodland at its back. Beneath that, a lease held by her father over a mill, and its wheel 2 parishes east. Beneath that, a share in a coach concern that ran between the market towns, purchased outright in her father's name and never assigned. Beneath that, 3 bank drafts, uncashed, folded neatly, made out to J. Shaw. Beneath all of it, at the bottom of the wallet, a single sheet in her father's hand, dated the winter before he died, that began, "To my daughter Laura, who came to me last and understood me first." Laura did not read it further yet. She opened the green ledger. It was a plain accounts book, but not the one Mr. Bramble had read from in the office. This one recorded the same sums twice over, what had been shown, and what had been kept, and where. On the last page, written in her father's slow, careful hand, was a list of 5 properties, 5 values, and 1 line at the bottom, underscored twice, for L, in the trunk, under the boy's things, in the corner, where the wood is joined. The tin box, when she pried its soldered lip with the blade, held gold. Not a fortune of it. Enough. Enough for a girl to stand on her own feet through a winter and a spring. Enough to hire a solicitor, who was not Mr. Bramble. Enough to travel to a village she had never heard of, and speak to a man named Sheridan, who had once kept a boy's things atop his papers, as agreed. Laura pressed the heel of her hand to her mouth. She did not weep. She sat on the flags with the deed for Hollow Marsh in her lap, and the cat against her knee, and she understood at last why her father had folded his spectacles. That afternoon, the wind turned. By evening, the rain had come again, harder than before, and by midnight, it was a full storm off the moors, hammering the thatch and driving under the door. Laura had put everything back into the false floor and closed the trunk. She had put the sealed envelope, still unopened, inside the bodice of her dress, against her skin. She sat by the fire with the cat on the hearthstone and listened to the wind take a slate somewhere off the roof and skid it away into the dark. Near 2 in the morning, above the storm, she heard a voice. It was thin and choked and coming from the lane. Laura went to the door and opened it against the wind and saw, in the flicker of what light there was, a woman on her knees in the mud, with a bundle held against her chest, and a boy of 6 or so gripping her skirt. The woman's shawl was black with wet, and her mouth was open, and she could not seem to make more than the one small cry. Laura went out into the rain in her stockinged feet, and took the bundle first, which was an infant, cold and quiet, and then she took the woman under the arm and got her up, and the boy came stumbling after them, without needing to be told. Laura brought them into the cottage, and shut the door on the storm. She built the fire up until it roared. She stripped the wet shawl off the woman and wrapped her in the gray shawl from the trunk. She peeled the sodden linen from the infant and put the small body against her own skin under her dress, above the sealed envelope, and held it there while she worked the fire higher with her free hand. She sat the boy on the hearthstone and pushed the cat gently against him for warmth, and gave him the last of the hard cheese. The woman said her husband had been taken up by a constable that morning on a false charge, and turned out of their room by the landlord that night, and she had walked 7 miles in the storm, looking for a barn. Laura said, "You will stay here." She said it quietly. She said it as a person who had, without knowing the hour it happened, come into possession of a house, a field, a wood, a mill, a share in a coach concern, and the right to open her own door to whomever the storm drove to it. The infant stirred against her skin and made a small living sound. Laura closed her eyes and held it closer, and did not let go until it was warm. By dawn the storm had passed, and the lane was strewn with slate and torn thatch. Laura wrapped the infant in the flannel shirt from the trunk and laid it in the crook of the woman's arm on the pallet. The boy slept with one hand in the cat's fur. Laura put on her mended boots, drew her cloak over her shoulders, and walked the 1.5 miles into Willow Creek with the leather wallet and the green cloth ledger under her arm and the sealed envelope still against her skin. The village was out picking up what the wind had left. A chimney pot had come down at the wheelwrights, and the same 2 boys who had laughed at her the week before were carrying broken slate into a barrow. They stopped when they saw her. One took off his cap without meaning to. Laura did not slow. She went first, not to Mr. Bramble, but to the house of a solicitor she had heard her father name once, kindly, over a winter fire, a Mr. Prescott of the neighboring parish, who kept an office above the corn merchants. She waited on his step until his clerk opened the door. She laid the wallet on his desk, opened it, and said only, "These were left to me. I would like them known." Mr. Prescott was a gray, careful man with ink on his cuff. He read for an hour without speaking. He turned the deed for Hollow Marsh in the light and held it to the window. He read the sheet dated the winter before her father died and set it down more gently than he had picked it up. He asked her 3 quiet questions. She answered each in 6 words or fewer. He said at last, "Your father was a thorough man. Everything here is in order. Everything here is yours." Word travels in a village faster than a cart. By the time Laura came back down the corn merchant's stairs, Mr. Ainsley was standing in the doorway of his shop with his hat in his hand, and Mrs. Ainsley had come out to the step behind him. Neither said the word trunk. Mr. Ainsley said, "Miss Shaw," and inclined his head, and offered her a fresh loaf wrapped in clean paper, without asking a coin for it. Laura took it and thanked him, and paid him anyway. At the churchyard wall, under the yews, Widow Halbrook was standing with her mended umbrella closed at her side. She looked at Laura, and Laura looked at her, and Widow Halbrook said, "So he did not fold them for nothing." Laura, for the first time in many days, smiled a small smile, and Widow Halbrook nodded once, as if a long debt had been paid, and walked away in her tight black boots. Margaret came to the cottage that afternoon. She came alone, without the maidservant, on foot, in boots that were not made for mud. She stood in the doorway and looked at the woman, and the infant, and the boy, and the cat, and the trunk against the wall, and she did not come in. She said, "I did not know." Laura said, "I know you did not." Margaret's mouth trembled once, and steadied. She said, "Adeline does not know yet." Laura said, "Then tell her." Margaret nodded, and stood a moment longer, and turned back down the lane, and Laura shut the door softly behind her, and did not watch her go. By the end of the month, a man named Sheridan had come from a village 2 days' ride away, an old man, thin and upright, and had sat by Laura's fire and told her about her father, and a boy who had died at 9, and boots that had been kept. By the end of the season, Hollow Marsh was drained a second time and sown. The cottage on the Willow Creek Road was re-roofed, and let at a fair rent to the woman whose husband, cleared of the false charge, had come home to her thin and quiet and grateful. The mill 2 parishes east turned again. The share in the coach concern paid a small, steady sum 4 times a year. Laura did not move into the house on Miller's Lane. She stayed in the tenant cottage through the spring and into the summer, and Ned mended the thatch properly with her, and the cat kept its place on the trunk lid at night. Mr. Prescott came out from the neighboring parish once a month with papers to sign, and each time he left a little more quietly impressed than the last. The villagers, when Laura walked into Willow Creek now, stepped aside for her, the way they had once stepped aside for her father, and she returned each greeting with the same small nod she had once given the rain. On a soft evening in late summer, At the hour when the light comes low across the fields and turns the thatch to copper, Laura sat on the stone step of the cottage, with the cat against her ankle, and the boy, the woman's boy, taller now, brown at the arm, throwing a stick for himself in the lane. The trunk stood open behind her, with the shawl folded inside it, and the boy's small boots set atop, as agreed. The sealed envelope had been opened at last, and read once, and put back where her father had left it. Laura held a cup of tea in both hands, and watched the light go. Widow Halbrook, passing on the lane with a basket, stopped at the gate. She looked at the cottage, at the boy, at the cat, at Laura in her mended boots, and she said, "You have done well by him, girl." Laura looked at the fields beyond the lane, and at the low copper light on the thatch, and she said quietly, "He left me more than a fortune. He left me the keeping of it." Widow Halbrook did not answer. She only nodded, and went on, and the light went on with her down the lane, and the cat pressed its head against Laura's ankle, and the boy came running back with the stick, and Laura set down her cup, and took the stick from him, and threw it again. Thank you for staying with this one to the end. If Laura's quiet road, from a locked trunk on a rainy lane to a keeping worth more than gold, moved you, leave a like, tell us in the comments where you were watching from, and subscribe so the next story finds you. Another candle is already lit. We will see you there.